So, Lone Rider here, and I just wanted to throw something out there that occurred to me this morning. I was thinking about the issue of border enforcement and how polarizing it gets. So many people can't even talk about it without throwing out accusations of, oh, you're a bigot, or you're this, or you're that, or it's like they're subscribing the worst possible motives to their, I don't want to even say political opponents, but people who just look at the issue differently, and in some cases might be political opponents. And I'm looking at it like this: how would you solve a problem? This is, to be fair, this is in my craw now because of an incident I heard about where somebody was here illegally, shot a police officer in California over the Christmas weekend. It was actually, I think it was the day after Christmas. And a story like that, it's going to make you think, right? It's an awful thing, and you wonder, well, what could have been done to prevent it so this guy might get to see next Christmas with his family. And the only thing I can think of, really off the top of my head, is if the person who was here illegally that did the shooting wasn't here. And it's kind of a no-brainer because, like, the laws that he was breaking are already against the law, so it's not like we have to pass any new laws. It's not like we have to institute any new programs. It's not like we even have to ask people to, let's say, make some kind of a personal sacrifice and give up some freedom as a result of a new law being passed, the way, is often done with, let's say, gun control, for example. The things this guy was doing are already against the law. We don't need to give the government any new powers. We don't need to institute any new programs. We don't need to ask otherwise law-abiding citizens to make any sacrifices or to give anything up. All we have to do is literally enforce the laws that are already on the books, or at least do so more consistently and more, efficiently. And things like this hopefully will become less common. They're already, to be fair, not the most common news items, but they do occur. And if you start looking into it, you realize it's actually kind of alarming, because every one of these crimes is a crime that wouldn't have happened if the perpetrator wasn't in the country, right? And I'm looking at it like, since this is in my mind, what would I do, right? Like, what, again, you hear about a horrible thing like this, and the first thing you say to yourself is, what could we do to maybe prevent this in the future? What could have been done in this case? And the most obvious thing that jumps out to me is, if the perpetrator was in fact here illegally, then, well, if he wasn't here, if we had enforced that law, then he wouldn't have been here to do the shooting. He might still have shot somebody else somewhere else, wherever he was from, but he wouldn't have been able to shoot somebody here in the United States. And the thing is, the sheriff of the department for which the officer worked has made statements to the effect that he believes the sanctuary city policy in that part of California prevented this individual, who had previous criminal arrests and so forth, from being deported in a timely fashion, and that perhaps would have, and again, if he wasn't here, he couldn't have killed the officer. So I'm looking at that and I'm saying, wow, right? But I'm also looking at it like this: what do all of our current proposals, essentially, to deal with people who are here illegally, or to address the problems related to people being here illegally, have in common? Whether it's DACA, which, by the way, just so you know, stands for Deferred Action Against Childhood Arrivals. Look up deferred in the dictionary. It doesn't mean permanent. It means just put off to a later date. So the people complaining that this past year there was a move to change DACA was always going to have to be changed, because it's deferred action, not revoked action, right? There's a difference. Anyway, get yourself to a dictionary ASAP if you don't understand the difference. Whether it's DACA, whether it's some form of legalization, a pathway to citizenship, or amnesty by any other name, or anything else, the point is, all of these measures, or even sanctuary cities, I guess, all of these measures that attempt to address the interface between people who are here illegally and the rest of American society, as well as law, all of these measures deal only with the people who are already here illegally. None of them, however, do anything to keep more people from coming here illegally, whether it's by physically crossing the border or by overstaying visas or whatever. What does this mean? Well, I'm looking at it as what we do to solve the problem, and every proposal on the table from the objectionable, like sanctuary city policies, to ones that might seem reasonable, like some kind of a legalization compromise. All of these proposals only deal with the effects of the problem right now, at this particular moment in time. None of them prevent that problem from continuing and causing more effects in the future that are going to have to be dealt with. Analogy. Some years ago, my folks had a flood in their house, a minor flood. Something broke. I don't know, it was a pipe or a water heater or something. But anyway, it caused some damage, and they had to redo some of the walls and the paneling and like that there. Now, what did they do? Did they start trying to replace the floor coverings and the baseboards and the walls while the water was still gushing? No. They waited until the leak was fixed, and then they began assessing the mess. And then they began trying to deal with the consequences of the leak, namely the water damage and what would have to be replaced and what could be saved and so on and so forth. And if you think about it, this is how you deal with any problem. You solve the actual problem and stop it from continuing, and then you deal with the effects. Right? Your house is on fire. What do? You put out the fire. Then you focus on trying to fix what's wrong with your house because it caught fire. You can't rebuild the fire damage to your house while it's still burning. I mean, one, it wouldn't be safe, and two, you'd just be going around in a circle, right? You'd fix something and then it would catch on fire and burn, and then you'd have to fix it again, and yada yada. You put out the fire, then you're like, well, okay, what do I need to fix? Same thing with a flood. If you have a leak, you fix the leak so it's not leaking anymore, and then you replace what's damaged, you fix what's damaged, you assess the consequences of that leak, and you attempt to deal with them. If you have a situation where you have a leak, like, for example, my folks' house, or like in the case of the border, right? I mean, let's make an analogy here. The border, leaks like a colander for whatever reason. Then the thing to do is to solve the porousness of the border, either through better enforcement, physical obstructions like the off-directed wall, whatever. But somehow solve the porousness of the border so we don't have as many people coming in, so that whatever we do to then deal with the consequences of the leak, namely assimilation, deportation, whatever you want to call it, legalization of the people who are already here illegally, that more don't keep coming in and we're not back in the same place 5 or 10 years from now. And I think this is especially telling because I think for some people, certain compromises, nobody wants to enable at least I don't think anybody does overtly, except for maybe some extremely political and cynical people who are exploiting the issue. But I think the average Joe citizen, I don't think, wants to encourage people to break the law or reward it. But I think there might be as unpalatable as the idea of legalizing people who are here illegally is, I think in some instances, for people who literally have not broken any other law except for the border law, they've never driven without a license, they've never committed a crime, and it's important I bring up the driving thing because a lot of people, when they say, well, they're otherwise law-abiding, they usually mean in terms of committing felonies. I don't know about you, but so-called non-violent Americans who are otherwise law-abiding kill something like 30,000 people on the roads every year. So just because you're not committing a felony doesn't mean what you're doing isn't a frigging public safety threat. And people driving without licenses on the roadways, when we all use the roads every day in our lives, no matter how we travel, whether it's by driving, walking, riding in a car or a bus, or bicycling, or riding a motorcycle or whatever, we all use the roads at some point in our lives every day, and so therefore issues of roadway safety are actually probably more likely to affect us than concerns about, the bad sheep that might do a crime or something. So, here's the thing. When people say they're otherwise law-abiding, make sure you include roadway infractions like driving without a fracking license, right? In my opinion, somebody who, if you're going to consider some kind of a legalization compromise or a pathway to citizenship or whatever you want to call it, nobody who's ever driven here illegally should be included in that, all right? That should be considered what it is, which is a risk to public safety and life and limb as severe and probably more likely to affect somebody as actual crimes, right? I mean, think about it. So yeah, let's be honest. Saying, well, they're nonviolent. Well, they may be nonviolent in terms of not committing a felony, but the so-called nonviolent acts they're engaged in are actually more deadly on a, in terms of likelihood of having an impact. So yeah, I don't have any sympathy for people who come here illegally and break the law, in addition to obviously breaking the law by being here illegally, which is a separate issue. So when people describe these people as law-abiding, first of all, I think we have to understand that they're overlooking that they're breaking the border law. They mean otherwise law-abiding, whether they specifically say that or not. But the point is, you can't describe somebody as otherwise law-abiding if they do in fact break other laws, which would include things like nearly committing a vehicular homicide. So, yeah, maybe this is more near and dear to me as a cyclist because of the danger of bad drivers. If you're out there in the open rather than enclosed in a box, like inside a car like this, you could survive several mishaps perhaps, whereas if you're out on a bike or a motorcycle, you're screwed. But nevertheless, the point is that when people talk about these folks as not committing any other crimes, let's make sure that they're not okay with DUI and driving without a license and like that there, and they're only limiting themselves to felonies. Because reality doesn't only limit itself to felonies. Again, DUIs and roadway infractions are actually more likely to injure or kill you. So, and they're certainly capable of as severe injuries being inflicted as actual felonies. So, let's not be intellectually dishonest there and endanger the public for the purposes of political pandering. But the point is, I brought this up because I think that there are some people who are either on the fence or might actually be okay with the idea of some limited compromise for legalization for people who haven't committed other infractions, besides from breaking the border laws. But those people will never find that palatable if they believe we'll be back here in 10 years doing the exact same friggin' thing. They would be okay with it as a one-time thing because we've addressed the source of the problem, which is people coming here or staying here illegally. However, since we have not addressed that, and all the proposals currently available are actually only about dealing with the consequences of that, not causing it itself to cease. I mean, I totally understand why people would say, of course I don't support amnesty, because what's going to happen? We're just going to have another amnesty in 5 or 10 years because they're not doing anything to stop people from coming over. Some people have proposed compromises where, some kind of, quote, pathway to citizenship or legalization or amnesty by any other name would be tied to the idea of border enforcement increasing. I would argue that's not enough. You have to make sure that the problem at the border is solved before you even consider what to do about the people who are already here illegally, whatever that is, whether it's deport them, whether it's assimilate them into society and legalize them, whether it's some mixture of the two or some compromise, etc. Why? Because, like the flooding in the basement, as long as that leak is still ongoing and more people are still coming in, you can't really address the problem of what to do about the ones that are already here, because the parameters are constantly changing. You don't know how many there are. You don't know how many there will be. As far as you know, you haven't dealt with the problem, essentially. So trying to deal with the effects while the problem is still ongoing, it's irrational. It's foolish. It's, what the hell are you thinking? Well, I think what the hell people are thinking is they realize that both for the individuals that are here illegally and for the communities in which they live and the society and the government that has to deal with them, and the taxpayers that in some cases are affected by the costs and the concern about them committing crimes or breaking other laws and yada yada, as well as the other side, that some of them may contribute to society in some way, shape, or form as well. All of these things people realize are an issue, and they want to solve that, both for these people who are here illegally and for the communities in which they live and for the broader issues of society and government and so forth. They understand this is a problem and they want to do something about it. The thing is, they're not dealing with the source of the problem, which is that the people came here illegally in the first place, and how to prevent more from doing so, at least in such widespread numbers that this would ever be a major political issue again. And that's the thing. There's always going to be some people who slip through the cracks, right? Murder's against the law, but people still get killed. Robbery's against the law. People still do robberies. But here's the thing. We don't have 12 million people running, or 20 million people, or whatever the figure is nowadays, running around doing robberies, and then having people talk about, well, we should just legalize the robbery because there's so many of them. It's a logistical nightmare to try and enforce the law against them, which is essentially the arguments that have been made against trying to enforce the law against the 10 or 11 or 12 or 20 million. Take your pick. The figures have changed since we really started talking about it in the 1990s, number of illegal immigrants in this country. And yes, I really do remember going back to the 1990s when I was in high school in 1993 or whatever, and things like Proposition 187 in California, which would have cut off government benefits to people here illegally, were an issue. And, in the intervening 20-odd years, we haven't done hardly anything to solve this. Everybody's grandstanded and poked holes in the air with their finger trying to make political hay with this, but nobody's actually tried to solve the problem. And part of me wonders if that's in addition to the fact that people don't understand that you have to treat it like a problem, like any other simple thing, like a pipe breaking and flooding your house. You have to look at it in terms of the sequence of things you need to do to solve it. I think there's also some cynical people, maybe in politics or even culture perhaps, who like the idea of exploiting this, who like the idea of having it as a political wedge on both sides of the aisle. And so maybe they just don't have any interest in actually trying to solve the problem. I don't know about that, but it's a possibility, and I think it would be remiss to ignore it. I don't think you can accomplish absolutely nothing in over 2 decades without really trying hard. But that said, if you looked at it the way you look at solving any other problem, there's a leak in your house, it's doing damage. Do you immediately go out and buy a new carpet and new furnishings for your house while it's still leaking? Or do you fix the leak and then try to assess and address the effects of it? Yeah, you fix the leak and then you try to do about the things that it has caused. And I think if we look at the issue of illegal immigration and the border the same way, we'll at least be a little bit ahead of the curve there, because we'll at least be basing our approach on something besides for rhetoric and pointing fingers at each other and calling everybody else names. Right? We'll at least be trying to look at it as a problem that should be solved rather than something that should be exploited to be able to point your finger at your political opponent and say, hey, you're a meanie. On right or out.